start putting on knee socks and putting on skirts for the meme and then suddenly have a cock in her ass. That's how this world works.
Seeing its first appearance in Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, Turbo Mode opened a new method of play by speeding up the chosen game's processing speed, accelerating not just you, the player, but everything around you. Enabling something like this can make the game both as intense as a bullet hell and as stylish as the Spectacle Fighter's namesake. And it seems to work pretty well, not just for Devil May Cry 3, but the series as a whole. So the question I wanted to ask is, can you beat Metal Gear Rising Revengeance on Turbo Mode? First, to achieve the Turbo Mode effect in MGR, we'll be using Cheat Engine's Speed Hack feature to accelerate the game's speed by 20%. Besides gameplay effects, this also makes navigating the menus a bit smoother due to the speed boost. I'd also like to acknowledge, for the sake of transparency, I am using a modified controller layout. This is more or less for convenience, as my tiny twink thumbs struggle with pushing multiple face buttons. So I've assigned the left bumper as a defensive offense hotkey, more on that later. This means its old function, use item, has been moved to D-pad up. Augment mode is select, and codec is left stick. Finally, I'm also taking advantage of a couple mods I personally enjoy using. Higher FOV and HUD effects respectively raise the field of view in game, and hide HUD elements that clutter the screen, like the minimap and hit counter. Upon starting a new save, I chose to go with hard difficulty for several reasons. Primarily, the more aggressive enemies would better showcase our modifications, on top of simply spicing things up a bit. Chapter 0 begins as usual, with the 3-on-1 to introduce you to the game's combat. I used this encounter to de-rust and refamiliarize myself with Raiden's attack strings. The next, however, was much faster, since it's designed to teach the player that a good chunk of fights can be ignored, and to keep an eye on your surroundings, as you might have to create your own entrances and exits. Doing so, I utilized one attack that is especially effective at cutting down enemies. If you perform a heavy attack during Ninja Run, Raiden will perform a sliding tackle that can be followed up with an axe kick. This follow-up can be cancelled with Blade Mode if you have the minimum amount of FC gauge, indicated by the glow. This allows you to make quick work of lesser enemies on top of not committing to the recovery of the slide. Not long after, we're introduced to the first boss of the game, Metal Gear Ray. And like any good boss, they seem simple at first, but have a fun amount of complexity under the hood. On your first playthrough, you wouldn't be blamed for assuming the one and only way to deal with them is to chip away at their legs, until you're randomly prompted to break pieces of their armor. However, the most effective way to defeat Ray is to just wait for them to hit you with a melee attack, parry it, and you're given a guaranteed armor break, with each doing anywhere from 20 to 30% damage. Additionally, for those that struggle with the fight, destroying the missiles they launch drop healing items, which is another learning moment the game gives you, so that you understand sometimes bosses will summon objects that can drop items to help you with the fight. Then, after a forgettable sequence of events, the fight moves to a rooftop, where you're taught more about unblockable attacks and Blade Mode's ability to destroy projectiles. You shouldn't have any trouble with this part if you remember to parry. During the clock tower sequence, if you stick to the right and jump, you shouldn't take any damage. And finally, after a cute train date with our baby daddy Samael, we finish up on the prologue. Upon starting chapter 1, I picked up aerial parry. It's not necessary, just more so of a personal preference, although if you do find yourself in the air a lot, I would recommend it since enemies can and will chase you. The first fight of this chapter is another 3-on-1 to teach us about Zandatsu, a mechanic that lets Raiden replenish his health and FC while finishing off an enemy. There is also a set of collectibles tied to this mechanic, in which you need to collect 30 left hands from specific enemies. I didn't go for it in this run, but I do recommend it as the rewards are well worth it. Moving on, we eventually find our first Gecko, which is this game's first roadblock to make sure you understand parrying. Besides its regular leg attacks, geckos also have a charging attack that, if blocked, will enter you into a QTE sequence. If you succeed, you'll be given a second prompt to enter Zandatsu, allowing you to make quick work of it. Geckos also have an unblockable grab attack, as indicated by the yellow flash. However, being hit by it doesn't immediately spell disaster, as you'll only take damage if you fail the following QTE event, and in fact, if you win, you'll throw it down to the ground to get some free hits off. Fun fact, the higher the difficulty you're playing at, the higher the chance geckos will shoot their turrets at you once at the beginning of the encounter. This might not seem like anything but cheap damage, but it's actually a cute way for the game to keep you on your toes if you're going for the no damage bonus, which is borderline mandatory if you want to get an S rank. Nonetheless, after using our stealth skills to sneak our way past a group of enemies, we encounter the first boss of the chapter, Blade Wolf. Blade Wolf's fight takes place over multiple phases, where they periodically retreat to summon more enemies before returning. All of their attacks are blatantly telegraphed, so they don't have anything that will take you off guard. Not to mention that it's very easy to get them off their feet with any attack string that ends with a heavy attack. In fact, now is probably a good time to discuss a mechanic most players won't encounter because the game doesn't tell you about it and there's next to no information about it online. dashing. As long as Raiden is a set distance away from the target, inputting the parry command while the enemy isn't actively attacking, you will dash towards them, closing the distance. At least, I think. Again, this game doesn't mention it, nor does anything come up when I look it up. I can only get it consistently during boss fights. I assume that's because it's a one-on-one and multiple enemies can mess with the targeting. Anyway, taking 2 steps across a bridge, we're ambushed by some helicopters and met with Hammerhead. And wow, if there is one benefit to turbo mode, it's that it makes the parts of the game that suck that much quicker. Shoot it with rockets and pray movement doesn't fuck you over. Making our way through the factory, I picked up the one and only health upgrade that I could remember off the top of my head, since I didn't want to spend any BP on them. Instead, I spent my BP on 2 essential skills: defensive offense and sky high. Simply put, defensive offense is the closest thing MGR has to a dodge. By pressing light attack and the jump button simultaneously, Raiden will perform a sidestep, giving him iframes while repositioning in the direction you input. Besides the damage mitigation aspect of the move, DO also has the benefit of allowing you to perform dodge offset, a mechanic seen in many Platinum games that lets you pause a given attack string with a dodge, then resuming the string where you left it. Sky High, on the other hand, is one of many launching attacks Raiden can use, the big difference being that Sky High has the strongest launching properties of these moves, allowing us to juggle even bosses. On top of those two, I also picked up Falling Lightning, which more or less is an air stinger that lets you home in on enemies in the air, making it a good air combo extender. For the rest of my BP, I invested it in damage and FC upgrades. Now we meet the final signature boss of this chapter, Mistral. It's at this point you should notice the gameplay loop of the bosses in this game, more specifically the mini objectives of their fights, past getting their health below 10% to bait out their finisher, beyond the aggressive, break their guard using Zandatsu, punish, repeat. That's not to say these fights are repetitive, just don't let your foot off the gas, as these bosses are at their strongest when you're playing too passively. The main move I'd say to watch out for is a spin move, as parry can and will mess up if you're not accurate, since the move is still active behind you. In fact, I would just recommend DOing into it for the sake of simplicity. During Mistral's second phase, she'll introduce multi-hitting moves into her moveset, which makes it very easy to have your guard broken if you're not expecting it. Additionally, you'll also notice her minions getting in your way, more due to the narrowness of the phase's arena. However, you shouldn't have much issue with that, as jumping over them isn't even necessary, as Mistral will usually find her way to you, or your heavy attacks will cleave through them. The third and final phase gives you a much more open space, which can give way to Mistral using her spin move more consistently. After giving Mistral the cold shoulder, we find ourselves at the end of Chapter 1. Sinking into Chapter 2, we're quickly introduced to the Mastiff, an enemy that appears way harder to deal with than they actually are. If you're aggressive, they almost never shoot, their melee attacks take years to start up and can be dismembered instantly and can guard break super easy. Even in groups, they're not an issue as long as you're paying attention to your surroundings. Not long after, we're also introduced to Raptors, which wield EMP attacks that can stun Raiden if you aren't careful. Still, they're only a threat in groups, which I assume is why they usually are. They can become enraged as their numbers go down, which causes them to only use their melee attacks, so they're actually easier to handle. Anyway, after breaking through Saturday morning cartoon levels of security, we find ourselves in a lab. Deliberately fail stealth because, let's be honest, it's a Platinum game, if it's not combat it's not worth doing. Nonetheless, after politely telling them to stop, I took a moment to pick some things up in the shop, namely Sweep Kick, Thunder Strike, and Lightning Strike. That last one's a big one. Later, we take remote control of the worst Roboraptors I've ever seen. This segment lasts exactly as long as it needs to. Wipe out the area we just wasted a minute not wiping out, then promptly get jumped by a grad. This boss has the wonderful trait of being unbelievably annoying for the first 10 seconds of the fight, until you corner it. Just toss an EMP grenade and call it a day. Jumping into Chapter 3, we're given that sweet old American welcome home. Have a chat with Dad, and get ambushed with the most annoying combination of enemies. Take the scenic route, and here you'll encounter a lot of sliders, which is where that Falling Lightning move comes in great, as you'll want these guys out of your way as fast as possible. You're also introduced to the Heavy Cyborg, and if you're looking for a Proto-Angelo counterpart, this is it. Slow, powerful moves, big and bulky, meaning they have more than enough health for you to juggle them for a lifetime. Eventually you'll find yourself dropping through an elevator shaft which transitions into an underground segment. I don't know which developer's idea of a cool joke it was to have a stealth segment where you're intended to use augment mode to see. However, it isn't all doom and gloom, as there is nothing stopping you from just bolting to the end of the area where you'll find a few enemies waiting for you there. Getting back to the surface, we're met with another grad, as they're now regular enemies. The best way to deal with them is to aim high, break their upper shields, and you'll have them stunned in no time. We also find that Blade Wolf has also been made into a regular enemy, albeit a lore-friendly counterpart, as Blade Wolf pulled the Transformers and swapped sides as soon as they got their shit pushed in. They shouldn't give you much trouble, as both, surprisingly enough, are much easier to deal with when their health isn't a part of your HUD. Up next is Monsoon, and if I had to pick one moment from the game that illustrated the difference turbo mode offered, it would be this, because up until now the game hadn't really been challenging for me due to the amount of time I had already sunk into it. However, the combination of turbo mode and the fact I hadn't played the game in a while made me feel like I was my first playthrough all over again. I was being caught out by his tricks I was previously accustomed to, my timing for certain sequences was off. With that being said, I had remembered that EMP grenades neuter Monsoon's unique gimmick of collapsing his body into several pieces in order to nullify your attacks. After bringing Monsoon back down to earth, we make our way inside World Marshal. Here we're greeted with waves of enemies as we wait for an elevator to activate. This sequence is on a timer, so there's nothing stopping you from ignoring the enemy and just hiding by the elevator, as only a couple cyborgs will follow you up there. Completing this, we're given another stealth segment. There's nothing stopping you from just running to each panel and getting caught. This will result in a raptor spawning to deal with you. As I mentioned before, they're only a threat in groups, so if you focus all the other cyborgs and then deal with it last, you shouldn't have a problem. Something you're rewarded with after defeating Monsoon is Raiden's Devil Trigger alternative, Ripper Mode. Simply put, Ripper Mode gives Raiden bonus damage on top of an armor breaking effect on hit, while consuming FC gauge. It works well with groups of enemies, letting you break them down quickly to avoid getting overwhelmed by them. Eventually you'll find yourself in a Japanese garden, the second half of which can be skipped by taking the route shown on screen. This will lead to a second elevator in which we're made to fight through a wave of enemies. This is where Ripper Mode comes in useful, as the game is pretty aggressive with what enemies it throws at you, so keeping your DPS up here is key. After making our way up, we're given a back-to-back rematch with Mistral and Monsoon, or at least their ghosts. To be honest, I found these versions of the bosses easier than their sentient counterparts. Maybe that is intentional, I don't know, but if you got this far, you clearly know how to deal with them. Once you begin your fight with Sundowner, you'll find that he has two distinct phases. The first will play defensive, hiding behind his shield, using it to punish you for being overly aggressive. The shield can be broken down through regular means by breaking his guard or by guarding his charge attack. His second phase finds Sundowner becoming more aggressive, trading his shield for a more powerful scissor movement, which incorporates unblockable attacks. All in all, Sundowner shouldn't give you too much trouble, as he has a surprising lack of health. By the time you get him into his second phase, you've most likely already got him in QTE range. Chapter 5 is where we notice a trend of increasingly shorter levels, with this one only having 4 segments, backtracking through Chapter 3's map, right up until where you resurface at the tunnel. Ultimately, this is the game's last hurrah for giving you a traditional level, so you won't find any surprises here. Just remember to look both ways before crossing. Chapter 6 is made of only one boss fight, Jetstream Sam. Honestly, this fight was a joy in turbo mode. I mean, it usually is, but playing this chapter really encouraged me to recommend that you play this game with increased speed as well. In its purest form, Sam's fight is the game's last check to ask, do you know how to parry, as almost all of his attacks can be parried, albeit with some unique timings. Specifically, Sam hosts several attack strings comprised of 4 hits, each performed with different patterns. On top of this, Sam has some unique behaviors, like skipping certain phases. His unarmed phase can simply be ignored by not completing the Zandatsu sequence. This is the case for his final phase as well, meaning that Sam can only die if you complete the disarm QTE, making for a good improvised training dummy.
Playtime's over!
Finally, we begin the 7th and final chapter, in which we break into the military base. This level has an interesting start, as you're told for once to ignore the enemy and just run past them. Despite this, if you're sighted, you have to kill everything around. You're not on a timer or anything, it's just interesting you're told that when in the one level in the game where stealth actually requires effort and thought. All the enemies here are cyborgs, so it's not particularly challenging, as well as the level itself is just one area before you begin 2 back-to-back boss fights. Missile Gear Exaltus has a moveset, of which a good chunk of is unblockable, so if you hadn't picked up defensive offense, now would be a good time. With that being said, it's more of a set piece than an actual challenge, just remember to jump the lasers. The next and final fight is with Armstrong, hosting 3 different phases if you want to call them that. First, you have your sword, second, without your sword. This whole sequence is a scripted loss, so don't worry too much about it, although some of his moves he uses are transferred to the third, real phase, unless you're playing on Revengeance, in which it turns into a horror game. Here, you will be challenged to utilize everything you've learned up until now. You can rely on dodge, but even then some attacks can slip through, so you're gonna have to be on your A game. Let me tell you, I felt the rust. Especially here, I forgot how hard this boss fight actually is. Ripper mode will definitely do you some favors here, as the damage is definitely useful. The debris throwing sequence is something you might want to memorize, although it isn't mandatory if you're willing to pay for it with your health. Completing it will reward you with healing items as well, so I'd recommend it. Ultimately, Armstrong as a final boss makes for a good skill check to see if you've actually learned how to play the game, as it's very possible to brute force your way through this game without mastering its systems. Armstrong, however, demands your full attention, requiring you to pay attention to his attacks and to know when to parry, not to guess. And this is only amplified with Turbo Mode, demanding even faster reaction times for his moves. So, can you beat Metal Gear Rising Revengeance with Turbo Mode? I wouldn't just say you could, I'd fully recommend playing with it. I experienced no bugs or game-breaking effects related to it, and honestly, looking back at vanilla MGR just feels sluggish by comparison. If you're looking for an excuse to start a new playthrough, I support it.
We're